Hello students, welcome to today's lecture. Now, basically we'll be looking at the aspect of clauses because that was where I stopped the last time. So I was able to explain to you what a clause means, then also the different types of clauses in which we looked at the main clause and the subordinate clause. And I told you basically that a subordinate clause is divided into three parts, which are the noun clause, known as the nominal clause. We have the adjective or adjectival clause, known as the relative clause. Then we have the adverbial clause. All right, so these are the three main types of subordinate clauses. Now let me illustrate what I've just said on the board for you to see. Now we're looking at clauses. Our attention is on clauses, and I remember I told you that a clause refers to a group of words which may or may not express a complete meaning or thought. Okay? Not all clauses express a complete meaning or thought. There are some clauses which do not express a complete meaning or thought. Examples are the dependent clause or the subordinate clause. Is that taken? Now, moving on from there, we'll examine the types of clauses. We have the main clause and we have the subordinate clause. Another name for the main clause is known as the independent clause. Okay? Then the independent clause can also be known as the superordinate clause. That's to tell you that we have two. We have the main clause, okay, and we have the subordinate clause. We have the main clause and we have the subordinate clause. Now remember, the main clause is otherwise known as the independent clause, or the superordinate clause, or the alpha clause. You can also call it the alpha clause, the principal clause. Now, for the subordinate clause, you can as well call this the dependent clause, or the beta clause. So these are the two basic types of clauses that is well recognized under this aspect. So what is the main clause? A main clause is a group of words which express a complete meaning. All right, that's a category. So for you to identify a main clause, what are the categories that would enable you to identify a main clause? The first thing is it must be able to express a complete meaning or thoughts. Can you see? So you must be able to express a complete meaning or thoughts. Then two, how else would you identify a main clause? You can also identify a main clause by having a subject. A main clause must have a subject and a verb. So a main clause must have a subject and a verb, which is very, very important. Then number three. Now, how else would you identify a main clause when you see such in a sentence? A main clause will never accommodate a subordinate conjunction, remember. So in this case, you have no subordinate conjunction. So no subordinate conjunction. So there are three categories on how you can identify a main clause in a sentence. The first aspect is that a main clause must express a complete thought or an idea, all right? Two, a main clause, as you can see, must contain a subject and a verb. It's very important. Then the third aspect is that a main clause would never accept or accommodate what's a subordinate conjunction. Is that taken? Now, this helps you to identify a main clause when you see such in a sentence. Now, number four, let me also tell you that it is highly mobile. A main clause is highly mobile. What do I mean by a main clause is highly mobile? That means that a main clause can either occur at the beginning of the sentence, all right, or it can occur at the end of the sentence. Yes. So it can take any particular form. It can take the initial positioning and it can take the final positioning. That's for a main clause. I hope that's understood. So look at the 4 categories that helps to distinguish a main clause from a subordinate clause. Now let's look at the category for a subordinate clause. So let's examine the category. Now before then, what is a subordinate clause? I already told you that a subordinate clause or a dependent clause or an alpha or a beta clause refers to a group of words, okay? It refers to a group of words which does not express a complete meaning. That's number 1. Number 2, a subordinate clause will depend on the main clause. Number 3, a subordinate clause will be introduced by subordinate conjunction. Is that taken? Then a subordinate clause would also contain a subject and a predicate. Let's take these 4 important functions. So how do you identify a subordinate clause? Number 1, you can say it does not express a complete meaning. That's the first aspect or idea. Number 2, how else would you identify a subordinate clause? Remember, this is a category for subordinate clause. And this is a category for main clause. Right? So another thing again is it is usually introduced by a subordinate conjunction. Okay, so that means if you want to identify a subordinate clause in a sentence, is mostly introduced by a subordinate conjunction. And I told you also that a subordinate conjunction refers to a word that is mostly used to introduce a subordinate clause. Now, examples of those words could be because, that, what, whatever, wherever, and many more. Okay, so those are examples of subordinate conjunction. Now, another basic difference is that, okay, it is highly mobile too. Yes, a subordinate conjunction is highly mobile. Now, by this, I mean that a subordinate conjunction can occur at the very beginning of the sentence. It can as well occur at the end. But remember, when a subordinate clause occurs at the beginning, it must be separated by a comma. Now, let me take that again. Anytime a subordinate clause begins a sentence, it should be separated by a comma. It's very, very important. So, another important method on how to identify a subordinate clause is the fact that it contains a subject and a verb, or you can practically say a subject and a predicate. A subject and a predicate. Is that taken? So now, here are 4 important categories on how to identify a main clause in a sentence. And here are also 4 important categories on how to identify a subordinate clause in a sentence. I hope that is taken now. Good. So that means that for you to form a very coherent sentence, you must have a main clause, all right? Then you must also have a subordinate conjunction and a subordinate clause. Very, very important. So, in other words, we can have a formula to say that you must have a main clause, MC, plus what? Subordinate conjunction plus subordinate what? Subordinate clause. So this alone would be able to form a sentence. So for you to form a sentence, you must have 1, a main clause. Can you see? You must have a main clause. 2, you must have a subordinate conjunction. Then 3, you must have a subordinate clause. All right, so this refers to the category on how to form a coherent sentence, an effective sentence. Now, I've been able to give a basic summary. Now let's look at, there are 3 types of subordinate clauses. What are the 3 types of subordinate clauses? So let's examine the 3 types of subordinate clauses. What are the three types of subordinate clauses? The first aspect is known as what? You can see we have the noun or nominal clause. Noun or nominal clause. That is, a noun clause is also recognized as a nominal clause. Then number 2, we have what is known as the adjective or adjectival clause. Okay, it can also be called the relative clause. So here we have the adjectival clause, or what is known as the relative clause. Now let me bring this to your notice. It is mainly known as the relative clause because it's also introduced by a relative pronoun. It is mostly introduced by a relative pronoun. And examples of these relative pronouns are, you have words like who, or whom, or whose. Are you with me? So, or that. So examples of the relative pronouns being introduced to form a relative clause. Is that taken? Now, the third aspect or the third type of the subordinate clause, the third type is known as the adverbial clause. Yes, it's practically known as the adverbial clause. And let me tell you this, which is quite important. Do you know that the function that a noun performs as a part of speech, a noun clause does the same? Also, the function that an adjective performs as a part of speech, an adjectival phrase or adjectival clause performs the same function. The function that an adverb performs as a part of speech, an adverbial phrase or adverbial clause performs equally the same function. That's to tell you that if your foundation is well grounded at the level of part of speech, when you get to the level of phrases or clauses, all right, it will be so simple. The slight difference could be the fact that at the level of part of speech, it's just a single word that you have to recognize to be a noun, or to be an adjective, or to be what? An adverb. However, at the level of phrases and clauses, we're looking at the combination of 2 or more words. I hope this is as simplified as possible. So that's why you need to pay attention to this. I've given you an explanation to the definition of what a clause is. Then I went further to tell you that we have 2 types. We have 2 types of clauses, okay, which is known as the main clause and the subordinate clause. I went further to tell you that under main clauses, it can also be known as independent, superordinate, alpha, and principal clause. Then under subordinate clause, I told you that it can also be known as dependent clause or what? Beta clause. That's B-E-T-A, beta clause. Then we proceeded to, for example, many students tend to ask the question, how would you be able to identify a main clause different from a subordinate clause? Now, there are categories on how to do so. Take a look at this. For you to identify a main clause, okay, the first thing is what? A main clause must express a complete meaning or thought. That is, to a large extent, a main clause must tell you what is happening, what is taking place. Now, also, if you look at the second category, you have a main clause must contain a subject and a verb. Then the third aspect is that a main clause, all right, you have no subordinate conjunction. Yes, a main clause will never accommodate or accept a subordinate conjunction. Yes, so important. Then the fourth part is that it is highly mobile. By highly mobile simply means that a main clause can occur at the very beginning, all right, or at the end. So it is not positional restricted to any form. It could occur in any particular form, either at the beginning or at the end. Now let's look at the categories on how to identify a subordinate clause. So you have, it does not express a complete meaning or idea. Can you see that now? Then it's usually introduced by a subordinate conjunction. That's for that, and it is highly mobile. That is, it also have the structural positioning. By structural positioning, I mean that a subordinate clause can occur at the very beginning, and when it does, you have to place a comma. When you start a sentence with a subordinate clause, you place a comma after that before you now illustrate the main clause. Now, number 3, it is highly mobile. I've explained that. 4, it contains a subject and a verb. Yes, it could take a subject and a verb. It could as well take a subject and a predicate. Then let's look at that. For you to form a coherent sentence, you would have this particular formula, which is you have MC, that's a main clause, plus what? SC, that's a subordinate conjunction, plus what? SC again, that's what? A subordinate clause. So all of these together will form a sentence. That's a coherent sentence. Is that taken? Now look at, we have 3 types of subordinate clauses. And what are those 3 types? The first aspect is known as the noun or nominal clause. All right. So another name for a noun clause is also known as a nominal clause. Now, by the word nominal simply means that it has the capacity to function as the subject. And of course, in a nominal group, you basically have a noun and a pronoun. Those are the 2 aspects that have the capacity to function as a subject. A pronoun can function as a subject of a sentence. A noun can as well do. Now, we have number 2. That's adjectival clause or relative clause. So it means that if you don't want to call it an adjectival clause, you can call it a relative clause. Remember, the same function that an adjective performs as a part of speech, adjectival clause does the same. No difference at all. So look at that. By the word relative clause simply means that most adjectival clauses are introduced by a relative pronoun. And don't forget the fact that we have 2 types of adjectival or relative clause. The first aspect is basically known as the defining relative clause. Okay? And the second part is the non-defining relative clause. So the defining relative clause can also be known as the restricted relative clause. And the non-defining relative clause can also be known as the non-restricted relative clause. I hope that is taken now. The basic difference between the 2 is just the fact that now the defining relative clause or restricted relative clause is direct, while the non-defining relative clause helps to give a further explanation and is mostly separated by a pair comma. Now we will proceed to the adverbial clause. Of course, the same function that an adverb performs as a part of speech, adverbial clause does just the same. By what? That is, it is a group of words here. It is a group of words here that modifies a verb at the level of a clause. So the focus is how it modifies a verb. That's at the level of a clause. Is that taken? So now take a look at this. I've given a simplified explanation to what a clause represents at the very, very basic. So what we're moving into now is to take the noun clause as an example. Then after which I'll give you a drill to attempt in order to enhance your understanding. So let's see how we could take this. All right, so under clauses, we'll look at noun clause. We'll consider a noun clause. All right, so you can call it a noun clause or a nominal clause. Is that taken? Now let's look at this. So this is a group of words the group of words, okay, which performs the function of a noun. The function of a noun. All right, so this is a group of words which performs the function of a noun. That is, a noun clause is a group of words which function exactly as a noun. So if I may ask you, what function does a noun perform? The same function that a noun performs at the level of a part of speech, a noun clause equally performs the same function, which is what? A noun or a noun clause will function as a subject of a verb. It corresponds. An object of a verb, a subject complement, an object complement, a prepositional complement as an appositive. So a noun clause performs exactly the same function, no difference. So you see the reason in which under English grammar, your foundation should be well grounded on the parts or the word classes. So a noun clause, this is a group of words which performs the function of a noun. So let's continue. It is usually introduced by a subordinate. It's usually introduced by a subordinate conjunction. Subordinate conjunction such as what, whatever, that, how, and so on. So now, for you to recognize a noun clause, there are specific subordinate conjunctions that a noun clause will be introduced with. And examples of those subordinate conjunctions are what, whatever, that, how, and so on. So it is very important for you to pay attention to this subordinate conjunction so that when you see a construction, you can easily tell that, oh, this is actually a noun clause or this is not. And let's look at the functions of the noun clauses. So we'll now take them one after another to explain. Let's take a look. So let's proceed to the other part, or we can term this functions of noun clauses. Functions of noun clauses. Functions of noun clauses. So what do we look at? The first important function is a noun clause will function as, as the subject of a verb. Can you see that now? So a noun clause would always function as the subject of a verb. So we're going to examine this first function before we proceed to the second function. What do we mean by a noun clause functioning as a subject of a verb? What that simply means is that a noun clause, which is a group of words, will occupy the subject position of the sentence, and it mostly comes immediately before the verb. Can you see that now? So it mostly comes immediately before the verb. Is that okay? So let's take the definition. The noun clause takes the subject position of the sentence and it occurs immediately before the verb. It occurs immediately before the verb. So now let's look at an example. Let's get an example. Look at this. that Nigeria